without that underlying trust and what sometimes gets talked about as psychological safety in a team, the idea that it's okay to put yourself out there, to take sort of risks and to talk about your ideas, we're not really going to be able to get very far or tap into all of the different kind of perspectives and information in the room.
Our world is full of bad meetings. We've all sat through them, and you've probably hosted at least one yourself. And there's a particular kind of frustration that comes when you're the one who brought everyone to the table, who gathered all the right people, and they have real things that they could contribute, but you're sitting there and watching the conversation stay shallow. Someone presents, maybe someone responds politely, there could be questions asked, but no one really answers. It feels like a waste of time, and the potential of that gathering is just lost. But this is not an episode about bad meetings. Today is about what's possible when we bring people together in the right way. Our world is full of tough problems that no one of us can solve by ourselves. If we want to make a difference, we're going to have to bring people together and start a whole lot of conversations, sometimes on challenging topics, often among people who don't know one another, or who may even explicitly disagree with or dislike each other. That's hard work, but it's how we build community and start to collaborate toward collective impact. In this episode of Storylinking, we're going to talk about starting conversations with our guest, Linn Vizard. Linn is a service designer and founder of the firm Made Manifest out of Toronto. She brings lots of people together in her work and has spent years thinking about the conditions that make real collaboration possible. Thank you so much for coming on, Linn.
Oh, I'm excited.
So I first met you, Linn, through this deck of cards that you created called Pebble Talk. And it's a deck of conversation starters. And since we're starting a conversation, I figured it might be fun to kick off with a card from your deck, if that's all right.
Yeah, great.
Cool. So the one I have here is what's a skill you learned when you were young that you still use today?
Ooh. Okay, in the spirit of not overthinking it, the first thing that comes to mind is I used to dance ballet, and I think what I really took away from, a decade plus of going to class 2, 3 times a week, being involved in all the amateur shows, the whole thing, was discipline and just the skill of, like, showing up to practice even on days when it didn't feel good or it didn't go well, and kind of that consistency and discipline, and that, I think, is something that has served me well, and I have really kept with me as a close kind of lesson. What about you, Tom?
That's cool. I would say, and I had the luxury of picking out the card and getting to think about my answer ahead of time, but I would say drawing. Like I am not
Mm.
particularly good at drawing, but like it's something I've done ever since I was a kid. And, like around our house, like we had plenty of paper and there was always like, markers and crayons and pencils and stuff like that. And then getting into school and like it was always just like I've really enjoyed anywhere that I can do something applied where like you can have
Mhm.
an idea and you can make something. Like that's just
Mhm.
an incredibly satisfying process. And, I remember like being young and like imagining like worlds that I could never like create with my own two hands, but being like, I'm going to draw that. And like, it wasn't perfect. Like, yeah, I'm still not that good at drawing things. I do it in the course of like creating storyboards and whatever. But like, I've been doing it for long enough that I've seen myself get marginally better at it over time. And that's, I think, a really important lesson too, that like there's these cycles of like thinking and making and like it's not always perfect and that's okay. But like, that did not lead me down a path to being a fine artist in illustration or anything
Mhm.
like that. But it's very much a part of how I think about creativity today.
Yeah, I love that so much. It's the first step to making a different future is imagining it, and drawing is such a powerful skill. I think actually that's something that stands out a lot in our work, and kind of the power of being a designer is like that idea that you can prototype or draw or create or envision is really powerful for people, and people get really excited by it when you can help bring their ideas to life.
That's great. Yeah, and just the sort of like you can take down the barriers, you can work with people. Like it doesn't have to be like the designer up on a hill, but you're bringing people into
Mhm.
the process.
Mhm.
So I brought the Pebble Talk deck out here early in our conversation, and so it's got a good, I don't even know how many, but it feels like maybe 50-ish cards in it, and they're all these different conversation starters. And like I said, I encountered you through this deck and through we've got a short series of lessons about like starting conversations. And I would love to understand how this came into existence. At what point in your career did you realize you were someone who is a conversation starter?
Mhm. Yeah, so my background and training is in industrial design. I thought I was gonna be all about making things and making beautiful things and aesthetic things, and I discovered pretty quickly that I'm really much more interested in the systems and people around the things. And what I also discovered when I started my career and started working was that, yes, the craft of design and envisioning and making and that process you described, um, is a really important process to hone and develop, and it's a lifelong practice. And what actually struck me is all the stuff around it is what's kind of hard, right? So dealing with people and collaborators and different agendas or goals, all of the different sort of perspectives that go into making something real in the world in a complex organization or team, figuring out how to scope projects, all of that stuff. I was like, this stuff is actually really the tricky stuff. And it became quickly apparent that if I was going to be able to do the type of work I wanted to do in the world, I would need to get good at those parts of the work. So bringing people together, facilitating sessions or workshops, participatory design, leading meetings and guiding kind of people and teams towards, the next step or next outcome we wanted in a process. Um, so really, I think it's been a career long process of trying to hone and develop that capability of, yeah, having better meetings, having better conversations, bringing people into the collaborative creative process. And kind of Pebble Talk is one manifestation of that, or kind of one very particular tool or piece that we can kind of dive into more through the conversation. But yeah, that's really where it came from, is figuring out like, how do you just get together and work effectively with other people who may have different perspectives and goals and incentives than you do.
I identify with that pretty directly, just in terms of your path. You were talking about like getting into making things and like designing things and the craft of that. And then at some point, that was your entryway to caring about people and systems and stepping back and seeing kind of the bigger picture and thinking about how you could help. And that's very much where I come from in terms of like, you know, producing, directing video, documentary film, like telling stories with people. And then at some point realizing that that's kind of what it's all about, is like, how can you bring people into the process and try to make the world a better place? How can you try to help people build systems? How can you bring people together around the tough problems? And that's something you can do with storytelling as well as design.
For sure, and I think that recognizing that the outcome or output of doing that in a way that taps into collective intelligence and many different lenses and perspective is much more powerful than anything you could have imagined yourself, right? I think, especially in design and industrial design, we have this kind of myth of the lone genius designer, like Steve Jobs, these different figures throughout design history that are really kind of held up and revered. But actually design, making things, storytelling, it's a collective, shared, relational process. And that's what I really love so much about the work that we do at Made Manifest. I think like fundamentally good design, good services, good stories, they are relational. And it's actually about relationship between groups of people at different kind of levels and scales.
So I think a lot of people will be familiar with at least like the basic concept of industrial design, like how do the things that we buy or use get created? Like who comes up with that and how do they make the choices about where it comes from? Can you explain to me a little bit like service design? What is that? How does that relate?
Yeah. So I would say the fundamental kind of process or approach is design based. So really using that toolkit of trying to understand and discover people's lived experience, the context, how does this sort of, thing or process or thing we're making live in the world, and how do people experience it? And then really just applying that to the services that, we all use every day. So you might have kind of heard this idea that we live in a service based economy, and services are really everywhere all around us. So we've worked on things like, how do you make getting a blood test a better experience, right? Um, how do you think about your first interaction when you walk into City Hall in Toronto? And so what's really fun and interesting about designing services is they have all of these different layers and parts and components that happen over time, and you're basically using the design process to try to improve the service and experience end to end, as well as different components or parts of it. So there's kind of a shorthand. There's this idea from, I think, a Fjord video that says, like, if there's two coffee shops right next to each other, service design is what makes you walk into one and not the other. So the idea of, like, what are those intangible experiential pieces that sort of stand out in the design or experience of it? And then also, what are the operational kind of backstage pieces that make it easy, effective, sustainable, profitable to deliver that service as well?
So it feels very, very human centered. Like, people are in the midst of all of that, right? Um, and I'm going to play devil's advocate for just a second here. So if I'm hearing this and I'm someone who can get people into a room and I have big ideas and I want to share them and I'm ready to show you why my ideas are the best and get you on board with them. Why does it matter if that's a conversation? Why do we have to have dialogue? Why can't I just, convince you?
This is a great question. And I mean, I think some people would say, well, you could, right? And it kind of goes back to the like um myth or ideal of these genius folks who are able to just set the vision, convince people, push forward, right? But I think there's a proverb I sometimes go back to. I think it's often said to be of African origin, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And because of the nature of our societies, our organizations, our teams, our nonprofits, our governments, we got to go together usually, right? Like to sort of achieve and coordinate and deliver on a grand idea or a great vision, it often takes a team or collective effort to make that happen. And so that's why I would say that all of this sort of happens in conversation. And of course, you can try to have more top down or autocratic decision making structures or organizations. But what you lose out is that piece we talked about earlier of the collective intelligence and the different perspectives, right? Because really, no one person, I believe at least, kind of holds all of the different knowledge and information and pieces and perspectives that need to come together to create something really amazing, whether that's something physical like a chair, or whether that's an experience like getting a blood test or buying a piece of luxury jewelry, or whatever it might be, applying for a grant from a nonprofit organization. So that would kind of be my argument. Like, we need to tap into that collective intelligence in order to be able to achieve those really big grand visions that we want to achieve.
I appreciate your laying that out. I think honestly, a lot of our audience is like going to be organizational leaders and community builders and people who have this like very implicit understanding of the value of bringing people into the conversation, right? But like I can perceive that and I can want that, and still it can be really, really hard. Like, I run a lot of meetings in my work too, and you can get a good group of people together and think you have everyone ready to go, and then you maybe even ask a question and it just feels like crickets. So, like, let's talk about that moment at the start of the meeting when you're setting a tone and you're trying to get people to, I don't know, trust each other, start to engage. What do you think about in that moment?
Hmm. Yeah, and this is so much of kind of where Pebble Talk was born. In our work, we're often coming into environments, by the nature of consulting work, where we have to very quickly sort of begin to build that functioning team effort with our clients, with our collaborators, with different folks across an organization or a team. Um, and I think the kind of foundational thing I really think about in that moment is, how can we get to know each other as humans first and kind of recognize our shared humanity? And how can we begin to build some level, even very micro level of trust? Because I think without that kind of underlying trust and what sometimes gets talked about as psychological safety in a team, the idea that it's okay to put yourself out there, to take sort of risks, to talk about your ideas, we're not really going to be able to get very far or tap into that group intelligence and collective intelligence and all of the different kind of perspectives and information in the room. So what I'm often thinking about in that is like, how do we just take a step back and start from these foundations of really getting to know each other? And that's where this kind of idea of doing some sort of check-in round or icebreaker or warm up or whatever you want to call it, that is a sort of fun, lightweight, ideally easy question that allows people to share as much or as little as they like. That's not actually directly work related or subject matter related to the project, is really just a way of creating that little bit of space to feel each other out as people first. Um, and to try to set the conditions over time for that better, more effective collaboration and teamwork.
Do you find when you start maybe kind of off in left field, like with a question that's a little bit of a non sequitur, do people tend to bring it back to work more often than not, or do they kind of just stay in that space?
Actually, that's such a great question. And actually, no, people really tend to stay in the space of the question because I think part of what it does by opening with a question like, what's a skill you learned in childhood? Or, if you could win a lifetime supply of something, what would you pick? It sort of gives people that permission and it's a little bit of a pattern interrupt, right? So it's the kind of pattern interrupt from the like, today's agenda is yada yada, and we're going to dive right into business. And one of the things we actually often do is, we will start the meeting right away. Let's say it's a virtual meeting with the check-in question up on a slide or screen share. And then when we've had a chance to do that check-in round, we'll have the agenda slide. And the agenda slide, first item is check-in. And we'll say, great, we've done that. So kind of just explaining and signaling that even before we get to the sort of down to business agenda, we've taken that moment. And it is a bit of that pattern interrupt, I think, to what people are used to. I will say that, of course, you do need to, especially if it's a first meeting, just set a little bit of context around, sort of perhaps why we do this, depending on the openness and willingness of a certain team or kind of organizational culture. But we typically just say, hey, like, we really like to start meetings with this check-in question. It's a chance to get to know each other. If we feel like there might be resistance, we'll sometimes say, this comes from organizational theory, and it's kind of shown to improve team performance if we kind of feel the need to justify it a little bit. But yeah, people are usually surprisingly into it. And we've even had experiences. One of my team members, Michelle, always loves to sort of tell this story, but sometimes we've worked in cultures that are a bit more sort of formal or buttoned up, and we've felt a bit hesitant about bringing in this type of kind of opening question. Um, and in one particular project, we actually sort of decided not to. There was some tensions on the team, and we kind of said, you know what, it just doesn't feel like a good fit. But as the project progressed, we said, like, wait a minute, like, why aren't we doing this? Why have we sort of given up this core approach and core belief? And we brought it in, and we were so shocked to find that this team was so into it and so up for it. And it really helped like change the dynamic. And someone who I had had a bit of sort of tension with, I think, in leading the project. We really got to know each other. This person, wanted to be like a Formula One driver, and they were so funny. And we were like, wait, why did we ever sort of skip this or decide not to do it? And from then on, we made a pact, even when it feels awkward, we're just going to try it. We're just going to do it.
Yeah, well, there's all this stuff that gets in the way, right? And we have our preconceptions about who other people are and what they'll tolerate and what they're gonna care about. And part of what I love about, as random apparently as some of the questions are in your deck, like I just picked the next one up, which says, "How do you eat your trail mix? Do you go for the good bits first or save them for last?" Like I have a passionate opinion about that I would be happy to share at the start of a meeting, and you would learn something about me through that opinion, right? And that, like you said, kind of brings us back to the humanity.
That's right, and it's funny because sometimes you do get these insights into who people are. The lifetime supply one, we had someone who was like, I would want a lifetime supply of gas," and just sort of so like pragmatic and practical and like so you do learn a bit about people. And I think what's also really nice is through some of these types of check-in rounds or questions, people also discover things in common. We had someone who said, "Hey, we've been using Pebble Talk at some of our meetings." And it sparked all of these connections where people were like, "Oh, I like hiking too. And, maybe we should do this and that." And, it sort of can create that space for building relationship and connection with your colleagues. It doesn't have to. It can just be in that meeting, in that moment, you learn something about someone and you learn you have something in common, or you learn something fun about them, um, or interesting, or unexpected. But like you said, the goal is really just like, let's learn about each other as people first, because that's going to help us to do better work together when we have a little bit of that shared understanding of each other as people.
Something else I appreciate about starting with a question like that too is you get into some turn taking very early on. Like you're like, if this is my meeting and I'm here and like you're, just going to sit there on mute the whole time. Like, we're going to go around the Zoom or we're going to go around the room and we're going to like at least ask everyone if they have something to share. And if you don't, that's okay. But like, let's open the door.
Yes, 1,000%. And that is really prevalent in some of the kind of research around these approaches. The idea of a check-in round or a conversational round at the start of a meeting, with a simple prompt, is really that it's an opportunity to kind of level set and to practice the conversational turn taking that is shown in research on teams, to lead to better team collaboration outcomes. Again, tapping into that collective intelligence that I keep going back to. But what you really do is you say, like, hey, the conditions of this space, the expectation that I'm setting as a host or a meeting lead or facilitator, is that we will create space and an opportunity for everyone to be heard. And what I think is so fascinating in kind of the research and in what we see as well is that when you create that lower stakes chance for everyone to have their voice heard, at the start of a meeting, it then leads to more equitable sharing of airtime and space later on in the meeting. So it sort of supports folks who might typically be quieter or kind of more introverted or not speak up, because you're sort of practicing this low stakes way of having your voice heard, and that notion of the sort of psychological safety risk taking, and that behavior is supported and encouraged. And that's an expectation of everyone. And so sometimes this can be, quite different to the dominant organizational culture where there are perhaps, more senior folks or kind of folks with more decision making power who tend to kind of dominate the conversation or the meetings. There can definitely be a culture of just sort of being on meetings or on calls and being off video and, on mute. And so really it's again trying to level set a little bit of like, hey, we expect and want your participation and you have valuable contributions to offer. And we really want to, create an opportunity in a space that, in as sort of comfortable a way as possible for you to bring those to the table because they're important.
Well, it reminds me a little bit of like starting a video interview, like, for a film project or what have you, where it's like, okay, well, we're going to sit down and maybe I'm going to ask you to spell your name, but like also we're just going to try to start talking like human beings for a minute. And we're going to try to have as natural of a conversation as possible before we get into the tough stuff,
Yes.
because it's like, you can't just always dive right into the deep end of the pool. Some people will be ready for it, but other people, like, some of your cards are labeled as deep and some are labeled as light or quick. And I'm like, you need those like quick questions sometimes where it's like, okay, that's a step that's on the way. That's like, if we can talk about, what's one thing, well, that's a deep one. If we can talk about sweet, salty, or spicy, choose one, then like, okay, we can probably then start to talk about our world.
Exactly. And I think there's this really interesting idea in kind of facilitation or meeting hosting, or, some of the way we'll construct our workshop sessions where you're thinking about how are you kind of stepping stone or laddering the kind of level of contribution and depth that you're asking from people. So exactly like you said, you're giving people that chance to kind of warm up. It's sort of in a design research or interviewing sense, it's the building rapport, right? Um, and yeah, I think, I mean, I love this stuff because it's so human. And so what we'll often try to do is structure workshops or sessions where, the first thing is a lighter, more, sort of, I don't want to say throwaway, but like a sort of lower stakes lightweight, simpler. You can kind of share as much or as little as you want. And then we'll kind of scaffold the following activities to get a bit deeper to ask for more contributions. So, maybe then we're moving into something like a more kind of co creative drawing, or asking people to contribute to some sort of like discussion question, or, work on a collaborative canvas. So you're sort of gradually trying to, you're not just like throwing someone in the deep end of the pool, but you're helping them kind of dip their toes in and sort of swim to their level of comfort as best possible.
So I can feel how this works in like a 5 or 10 or 12 person meeting. What happens if I don't have enough time, or I have so many people that there's no way we're ever going to make it around the room to learn about everyone in that kind of way?
Yeah, yeah, great question. And definitely comes up a lot. I think a lot of, particularly large corporate cultures, you have these huge calls with like 30 plus people on them potentially. And so, there's a few different approaches that you can take. So, one, again, depending on whether this is a sort of in person meeting or a remote meeting, again, depending on your kind of goals and objectives, you can split people off into smaller groups, right? And have them do this kind of check in or warm up in a smaller group. So you can use some kind of breakout room functionality if it's a virtual meeting, or you can just have people kind of cluster in smaller table groups, or do it at their table if you're running some sort of workshop session. Um, so I would say that's a great option when you truly want to build that environment where people are going to contribute, and you are going to work collaboratively together over time in some way. I think for larger calls that are less collaborative, we still like to start with a simple check in, and we often use a kind of one word check in that people can do asynchronously. Let's say if it's a remote meeting in the chat. So we'll have something up on screen as people are coming in. Could be one word for what you hope to get out of this meeting today, one word for how you're feeling coming into the meeting. Sometimes we'll do things like one word to describe, the current service experience of, XYZ that we're working on. And you just let people give their input asynchronously in the chat, for example. And then what you can do is, pick a couple of interesting responses, or a variety of responses, and ask if folks would like to share a little bit so we at least hear some voices. And you can think about, how do you not just go to the most senior person in the room, or the person we hear from the most? How do you kind of hear from some different voices? So that can also be an option. And similarly, in a in-person setting, you can do something like that, have people write on a post-it, post it up on a wall or a board, or, kind of popcorn a couple options, who has something similar, who has something different. And then as the facilitator, you can use this as a bit of observation around, I'm noticing these themes. I'm noticing lots of folks are, really hoping to get clarity out of this meeting. So let's loop back around to that and make sure we're all kind of clear at the end. Or so, there's some different ways to adapt the technique when you are in those really, really large settings. And just thinking, I think with all facilitation, kind of hosting, convening work, just thinking carefully about what is your goal, what is your objective, and what's going to be the appropriate approach and tool to help you get there.
A colleague of mine has a variation of the chat thing. He calls it a chat storm. So, like, very much of, the Zoom world. And the only difference is, everyone types in the chat, and then you try not to hit send. Inevitably, someone does, and it's
Yes.
okay. But you try to all hit, send at the same time. And I kind of love that for giving people time and space to think. And then
Yes.
also, like, no one really has to be brave and go first. Like, maybe you are accidentally, but like, it's kind of just all there in a very flat way where, again, like, no, if you were waiting for the boss to like type their answer, like that's going to come at the same time as yours. If you're like
Yeah.
just nervous about engaging, you can, write one or two words. And again, it's like it's a stepping stone toward something you might talk about in some more depth.
Yes, I love that. I think we call that waterfall. So you kind of get everyone to hit send at the same time, and you get this waterfall of responses. And I think that can be a really fun one. I'll often use that for closing, like what's the most useful thing for you today, or what's one thing you're taking away from today, or one reflection. And then you kind of have them all flood in, and it can be a really lovely way to close as well. But yeah, absolutely. The other one for remote meetings is using some of the, a lot of the platforms now have like emoji functionality. So sometimes we'll sort of play games like, stand up if you're in person and people are able to stand. Of course, need to be inclusive and think about, what's an inclusive option for the bodies in the room. But, stand up if, you prefer pizza to hot dogs, or, and you can use the emoji reacts on Teams or Zoom to kind of get some of that, feedback as well. Sometimes we'll have those questions on slides. So there's really lots of like fun stuff you can do. And I think, like you said, um, it's all just about building a little bit of that comfort and sort of safe ways to participate and interact that lay the foundation then later on. And what we find a lot with kind of using these techniques in our work is, it's not that you do this in one meeting and sort of everyone's, amazing collaborators and totally comfortable and all the power dynamics are gone. And, of course not. But it is sort of over time practicing that muscle and setting those conditions that, hey, we're all human here, we all have things to offer, we all have valid and valuable perspectives, and this is how we strive, or this is the aspiration for how we collaborate and work together. So yeah, it's definitely not going to sort of solve everything in one go, but over time I think it really does make a huge difference.
So we're together for the meeting, right? And like hopefully it's as good a meeting as it can be. It's a conversation and not a presentation. And then the meeting ends at some point. And like you said, we can do these things to sort of like create a sense of, again, like humanity and community as you're wrapping up. And I think that's important. But what about like accountability? So like if we're bringing this group together, if there's some intent to have a series of conversations or build toward some kind of like shared action, do you have any favorite ways for helping to build that bridge, like to help people get to what's next as a meeting's wrapping up?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things come to mind. One is thinking about, who kind of owns that in a way, or who's accountable. So, for us in consulting roles, often it's us. We are sort of, guiding and shepherding the process, and we are holders of, okay, what comes next and setting people up for success. So we will, of course, always have some way to say, like, here are the next steps. Here's who's doing what, here's what we need from you. So I think not underestimating the need for someone to actually hold that process. And I think facilitation work, meeting, leading work, whatever you want to call it, is sometimes it's underestimated, right? Like it's sort of this invisible glue, but it's actually really important. So making sure that there is someone who's sort of dedicated or accountable, or that is their role, I think is really helpful. Um, there's also some great exercises you can do. I think it's like who, what, when. So basically, in a collaborative canvas or on a flip chart, what are the action items coming out of this meeting? Let's come up with them collectively, and then let's sort of assign ourselves or talk about what makes sense and when does this need to be done by. So as much as possible, I think this is a thread that weaves through kind of this designerly approach to things. How can we create that together, and how can we have it be something we have co-created and agreed on as a group, not so much something that like Lynn is sort of assigning and trying to sort of give people homework, or something that Tom is deciding, but really saying like, let's co-create together what makes sense as the next steps. And mileage may vary. Again, there's a lot of different factors in terms of organizational culture and decision making styles, but those are kind of the two things I would say are helpful. And then making sure it's documented, right? And someone is sending out the follow-up, hey folks, here's the photo of the flip chart of who, what, when, uh so that there is that continuity and access to that information.
Make it easy to find and easy to take those next steps after the meeting too.
Exactly.
I think I heard you use the word together as a noun in what you were just saying, and I love that, this idea of together as a thing we can make and create. Like, there's so many different words for people coming together around some kind of a purpose, right? And whether it's community or organization or neighborhood, like it's just like there's this idea, I think, underlying both of what you and I do, that like it's going to be better if you can get the people together. So like let's make the together.
Yes. Yes, I love that.
So that's our audience too, right? Like we're talking, with people who are in an organizational leadership capacity, might be doing community storytelling, but generally are trying to create that sense of together. and might be themselves hosting meetings. So I wonder if you have any ideas, like any advice beyond what we've already talked about in terms of like just a few practical things people can start to apply immediately. Like if I'm getting ready for a meeting as I'm listening to this, what might I think about as I'm getting ready to kick off?
Yeah. So I would say one thing is, can you think about an experiment with the input modes that you're going to enable in a meeting? I think often we prioritize, verbal people talking. And that can work well for certain personality types. I like to say I'm a yapper. I'll talk all day, no problem for me. um, However, how can we think about some of the other options available to us? So, whether that's giving folks that chance to write something down on a post it, for example, the classic design, thinking tool, whether that's the chance to put something in the chat or use an emoji like we talked about on a digital or virtual meeting platform. So, what's really nice about that is it opens up participation modes for folks who may feel less comfortable speaking up, and it also opens up this magical thing that I love, which is kind of parallel and asynchronous input. So the thing about talking is that typically one person can talk at a time, at least for it to be effective and for people to be heard. But then that's also creates a constraint, right? Like if you have 10 people in a meeting, sometimes I do what I call facilitation math. I'm like, if we've 10 people and everyone gets 2 minutes, then you're already up at like 20 minutes of time, plus you got to figure out transitions. So anyway, my point being, think about the different modes of participation that you might be able to model or enable. um, the other thing I would say is, are there some of these approaches we've talked about, whether that's that little check-in round at the start of a meeting, that you could begin to experiment with? And I would say start with the meetings that are um, the sort of most quote unquote safe feeling for you or the most familiar. So perhaps that's your weekly team meeting and it's only, 3 or 4 people and you have it every week and you know each other well. And that's a great opportunity to say, hey, I want to try out this new thing. Could we try it together? And sort of build that muscle. If it's newer to you, that can be a really great way to start before you kind of bring it to larger forums. The other thing that I'll say, the last thing that I'll say on this is something that often comes up when we kind of do workshops or talk about or teach these techniques um, is, what if my culture is like camera off, no one ever talks. Like, what if the idea of putting up one of these questions and getting everyone to talk about their first job or is just so like out of the realm of possibility for us right now? And what I always like to say is try to start where people are. So if you have a culture that is, people are, let's say it's remote, they're off camera, very few people speak up in a meeting. Maybe don't expect everyone to turn on their cameras and do a verbal check-in round like next time you meet just because you want to introduce it or try it. But maybe you could do an async round in the chat, right? And then maybe after you do that a bit, you could do a voice only round and you could invite folks to, they don't have to turn on their cameras, but they just use voice. So again, how do you scaffold or build towards some of these things, meeting people where they're at? Like, what are the modes of interaction and participation that are currently more comfortable or more familiar? And then the kind of other piece to that is, if you need to convince people, I think framing it as a bit of an experiment. Hey, I'd love to figure out ways we can all, collaborate more and learn from each other more. I heard about this interesting practice of check in rounds. There's some science that backs it up. I can send you some links. Would you be up for trying it for a month? And then we can see if we want to keep going. So just finding ways to make it feel safe and really meeting people where they're at. Those are a couple of my ideas for how you could just gently start to incorporate these techniques.
I so appreciate the kind of stepping stone approach you're talking about because, like, I think there are lots and lots of people in organizations and in, different groups who want to be human centered and want to be building things together and might not be the CEO. And so, like, how do you start to ripple that out from where you sit? Right. And it doesn't have to be organizational cultural transformation all overnight. It can be little bits and pockets that feel good and then trying to grow that.
Yes, I love that point, Tom. This actually came up most recently when we ran a kind of workshop session at a conference around some of these tools and ideas. And someone was saying, like, oh, well, how can I make, XYZ kind of cross functional partner or team or, department? How can I make them do this? And I sort of said, well, you can't really, you know, but what you can do, exactly to what you're saying, is you can start with your immediate team and colleagues, and you can build from there. And I think what's also interesting is, you have the opportunity to model that, right? So even if it's just you in your smaller team or your direct reports or your pocket of the organization or community or nonprofit or, the neighborhood meeting that you host, right? Like, where is a place you do have some power, either in how you host or just in how you show up, where you could begin to practice. And then when other people see that, perhaps they might say, that's interesting. That felt good. I might want to try that, or I might want to learn about it. Um, and I mean, I think what's so lovely about this, like I used to do some of this type of thing with a team that I managed like many, many years ago. And recently I caught up with someone who was on my team, and she said, oh, every Friday with my team that I manage, we do this like coffee chat round question. And it's just so interesting to see how it can really ripple, and it can be something that people adopt and adapt and, use in different ways. And so I think that's exactly right. Like, how do you just start where you are? And some of that for us in our work and in our projects and with our clients and, the people we work with, is it's partially about how we show up to a meeting, right? Like, we're showing up not taking ourselves too seriously, willing to give it a go, willing to talk about silly topics like, if we went back to the 1800s, like what item would we bring to impress people, willing to kind of just get it wrong or say I don't know exactly what technology they had then. And it's a little bit of like you're modeling that stance, and sometimes it can be jarring or not a fit for certain teams or organizations. And sometimes they're like, oh, that's an invitation and I'm curious and maybe I'd like to try, or maybe I want to get into it. And sometimes it's not, people aren't ready, or that's not sort of how they want to approach it, and that's okay too. But I think there's so much power in like how you are showing up and how you're being in these contexts. So yeah, I love that idea. Just start where you are, start small, and it can really ripple. And know that you're not going to change everything either, right? Like, having reasonable expectations is something I've learned too.
But if you can be human, then it's an invitation to the people around you to also be human.
Exactly.
So as we're wrapping up, if people want to learn more about your work, Lynn, where can they find you? Where can they learn more, see what Made Manifest is doing, maybe get their own Pebble Talk deck?
Yeah. Um, so I always love folks to sign up to our newsletter. I write a monthly-ish long-form newsletter about all these types of topics, called Ask a Service Designer. Tom, I'm thinking we can share some links in the show notes. And it's a free newsletter, and that's a really great way to keep up with kind of the things that we're doing, as well as deep dives into all of these different topics that we've talked about today, and many more around service design. Um, People are welcome to reach out on LinkedIn. I love hearing from folks who've listened to the podcast or read the newsletter. Pretty easy to find, Linn Vizard. And then you can also check out mademanifest.com. So it's made-manifest.com, where we have case studies and links to podcasts and all our resources and blog posts. And you can link out to Pebble Talk there if you want to take a look at the deck and maybe get your own.
Wonderful. We will absolutely include some links in the show notes. And Lynn, thank you so much for coming on Storylinking. It's been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate what you're sharing here with Pebble Talk.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom. It's a pleasure. And it's always so wonderful to connect with other folks in other domains and practices who have shared kind of values and approaches and ways of thinking about the work and bringing people together. And it's definitely sparked some thoughts and ideas for me around like the unit of story, right? As this really fundamental unit of what it means to be human and connect with people and do good work. So yeah, thank you so much.
Starting conversations is, in a lot of ways, the beginning of everything good that we need to do in our world. Community doesn't emerge from agendas, it emerges from moments where we actually connect with each other. And those moments have to start somewhere. That's both an opportunity and a responsibility. And I'm grateful to Lynn for the reminder that we have more influence over that starting point than we might think. The conditions we create in just a couple minutes, where people feel safe enough to speak, where they might sense that their presence actually matters, shapes everything that follows. And that doesn't have to require a total reinvention of everything we do. Sometimes it's as simple as a single, well chosen question to kick it off. In my conversation with Amanda Lee Kaiser a few episodes back, we were talking about starting with emotion, thinking about how you want people to feel in a meeting. I think this is kind of the next step. What Lynn is teaching us is what it looks like to build on that intention of a feeling with a conversation, with a question. And I would encourage you, if you're going to be bringing people together around something that matters, what would it look like to be more intentional about how you open? What's one conversation you have coming up where the stakes are high enough that it could be worth thinking carefully about how you start? Try it with a single question and see what opens up. If you find a particularly good icebreaker question or any other good way of getting people to talk to each other, visit storylinking.com/talk and please share it with us. I'm Tom Leitz, and this is Storylinking.